The limestone step is narrower than it looks from above. Its edge is rounded by hands, sandals, and centuries of weight. The wall beside it is pale, chalky, and cold even in heat. Down there, beneath the Hall of Isaac in Hebron, the air tightens, stone holds the temperature, dust settles into the cut lines. Nothing about it feels symbolic. It feels built, measured, closed. In 1267, after the Mamluk takeover of Hebron, access to the lower spaces beneath the sanctuary was placed under strict control. Jews and other non-Muslims were denied entry below, not rumor, administrative restriction. A sacred site became a controlled site, and once a place goes under custody for that long, the silence around it starts to look natural. Then, the silence broke in a way nobody expected. In October of 1967, 13-year-old Michal Arbel was lowered through a narrow opening in the floor of the chamber above. She found a staircase, a tunnel, a larger room. In 1981, another clandestine descent pushed farther. A stone slab was moved. A vertical passage opened. Below it were two caves, one above the other, with dirt, human bones, and pottery inside. 4 earthenware pieces were removed and later dated to the First Temple period. The claim at the center of this is direct. The Book of Jasher preserves a burial tradition tied to Adam, and later Jewish sources place that burial chamber at Machpelah, beside an opening to Eden. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what the evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If buried chambers beneath sacred ground fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from scripture and records. But here's what makes this stranger. The Book of Jasher does not waste time on abstract language when it reaches Adam's death. In chapter 1, verse 12, Adam and Eve are driven from Eden and settle east of the garden. Then, chapter 3, verse 14, gives the detail that matters. Adam is buried in the cave which God had told him. That line is the hinge. It is not just a burial. It is a directed burial, a known cave, a specified place, not an open field, not an unnamed tomb, a cave identified in advance. That wording entered English most famously in 1840, when Mordecai Manuel Noah published the first English translation of Sefer HaYashar in New York. Noah's preface ties the work to the Hebrew editions printed in Venice, commonly dated to 1625, and treats it as an old text of real antiquity, even while stopping short of calling it canonical. Later scholarship took the work apart, argued over its age, and pushed it into the category of medieval midrash. But even critics kept returning to the same fact. This text preserves early material that was circulating far earlier than the surviving printings. Edward J. Brandt, writing at Brigham Young University in 1986, made an important observation that often gets skipped. He argued that the extant Book of Jasher is not the missing biblical source mentioned in Joshua and Samuel. But in the same analysis, he also noted that much material in late Jewish writings can preserve genuinely ancient elements. That matters here because the burial cave tradition is not isolated. It sits inside a much wider chain. The wider chain appears again in later Jewish sources. Talmudic discussion in Eruvin 53a and Bava Batra 58a treats Machpelah as a doubled cave, either 2 chambers side by side or one above the other. Later mystical tradition goes further. The Zohar links the cave to Adam and Eve. A long-standing Jewish interpretation places an opening to Eden there. By 2023, UCLA professor Fred Astrin was still summarizing the oldest Jewish traditions in exactly those terms. Adam's tomb, not in some vague Eastern memory, but in the cave of Machpelah at Hebron. And this is where it gets disturbing. Because once you line those pieces up, the pattern stops looking accidental. Jasher says Adam was expelled east of Eden and buried in a cave God had designated. Later Jewish tradition identifies Adam's burial with Machpelah. Rabbinic sources describe Machpelah as doubled. Modern descents under the sanctuary report a staircase, a chamber, and then two caves, one above the other. The language changes, the architecture does not. What we're looking at breaks into 5 parts. Part 1 is location. Jasher 1:12 places Adam and Eve east of Eden after expulsion. That matters because the text does not treat Eden as erased. It treats Eden as a real fixed point, with human movement measured from it. East of Eden is geography, not decoration. Part 2 is burial instruction. Jasher 3:14 records Adam's death at 930 years and says his sons, with Enoch and Methuselah, buried him in the cave which God had told him. The line is brief. The line is flat. That is exactly why it matters. Ancient texts tend to reveal their strongest claims in the least theatrical language. Part 3 is inheritance of the cave. In Jasher 24, the narrative turns to Abraham's purchase of the cave of Machpelah as a permanent burial possession. Sarah is buried there. Later, Abraham is buried there. Then Isaac. Then Jacob. In Jasher 47, Esau's sale of burial rights connected to the cave appears as part of the family inheritance struggle. The cave becomes dynastic. It is no longer just a tomb, it is a controlled ancestral chamber. Part 4 is identification. Later Jewish interpretation joins the two lines. Adam's cave and Machpelah become the same place. That is where the doubled structure matters. The cave is not just old, it is layered. It is a place where later patriarchal burials occupy a site already treated as primeval. Part 5 is physical confirmation. In 1967, Michal Arbel documented a stair, a tunnel, and an inner chamber. In 1981, explorers found the lower cave system itself, 2 caves, one on top of the other, filled with earth, bones, and pottery. That is not a sermon. That is spatial correspondence. Now stay with the wording, because the wording is where most people miss it. Jasher does not say Adam was buried near a cave. It says he was buried in the cave God had told him. That suggests prior disclosure. A known sacred cavity, a designated resting place already connected to his life, his exile, or his return. When later texts place that cave at Machpelah and describe Machpelah as an access point to Eden, the tradition is no longer random accumulation. It is a memory structure. The modern parallel comes from archaeology, not devotion. In 1981, pottery removed from the lower cave was examined by Dr. Zeev Yavin, then the chief archaeology officer for Judea and Samaria. The earthenware was dated to the First Temple period. That does not prove Adam. It does prove something else. It proves the chamber below was not a literary invention floating free of place. Real ancient use, real subterranean space, real continuity of burial association. And the reported layout, 2 caves one above the other, tracks closely with the old description of Machpelah as doubled. There is another detail that pushes this farther. Benjamin of Tudela, writing in the 12th century, described being led through an iron gate and down into a sequence of caves, the final one associated with the patriarchal burials. Centuries later, the 1967 and 1981 entries describe stairs, tunnel access, and layered chambers again. Different centuries. Different witnesses. Same basic geometry. A descent, an inner space, another chamber beyond. Here's what the translators left out. The title itself. In some interpretive traditions, the Hebrew word behind Jasher was softened toward the idea of song, as though the lost source in Joshua and Samuel were mainly poetic material. But the more stable reading is the upright, or the just one. That shift matters. If you hear Book of Songs, you expect praise language, compression, liturgical style. If you hear Book of the Upright, you are dealing with remembered records attached to named people, places, and burials. One translation turns the source lyrical. The other keeps it archival. And once it is treated as archival, the burial cave line stops sounding ornamental. There is a second omission, more subtle but just as important. The English translator of Sefer HaYashar dropped the original rabbinic reading divisions and replaced them with modern chapter and verse formatting. That made the book easier to read, but it also detached it from the older synagogue structure that signaled communal transmission. The text was modernized on the page. It became easier to dismiss as a curiosity and harder to recognize as part of a preserved interpretive chain. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea, around 363, when non-canonical books were barred from public church reading. That did not target Jasher by name, but it fixed the rule that texts outside the accepted reading list would live at the edge. Then the canon walls hardened. By the medieval period, works like Jasher could circulate, but under suspicion. In 1267, Mamluk authority restricted access to the physical site in Hebron itself. The text remained marginal. The chamber remained closed. Then came another layer of damage. In 1751, a fraudulent book, also called Jasher, appeared in English. That counterfeit poisoned the title. By the 19th century, reference works were cataloging Jasher under fabrications, and Noah's 1840 publication had to argue, in its own preface, that this was not the same fraud. One false version made the authentic textual tradition easier to wave away. The name was discredited first. The evidence could be ignored after. By the 20th century, the two kinds of suppression had fused. The text was labeled late. The chamber was inaccessible. Scholars debated genre on paper, while the actual subterranean space remained under restriction, entered only in rare, irregular descents. That is how difficult material disappears in plain sight. You do not always destroy it. You fence it off, complicate it, rename it, and wait. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2021, renewed reporting on research into the Cave of the Patriarchs made clear that material from the 1973 Operation Adar descent was still not fully open. Photographs and items from that entry were described as classified. At the same time, underground access remained tightly controlled, and the lower cave system was still not available for normal archaeological examination. The upper sanctuary is famous. The lower chamber is filtered. Even now, the site is visible and hidden at the same time. That is the part people tend to miss. Ongoing restriction does not need to look dramatic. It just needs to keep the crucial layer out of ordinary study. No broad excavation. No open survey. No regular public descent. No settled, transparent publication of everything found across those entries. The result is predictable. Everyone knows the name Machpelah. Almost nobody is allowed to treat the lower chambers as evidence. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there is a fully preserved antediluvian archive sitting under Hebron waiting to be opened. But what the text and the evidence describe, when you look at it carefully, matches an old burial chamber tradition attached to Eden, Adam, and a real underground complex that later generations repeatedly located, guarded, and reused. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If Jasher preserves a directed burial in a named cave, if later Jewish sources identify Adam's resting place with Machpelah, if those same sources describe Machpelah as doubled, and if modern descents beneath the sanctuary report a two-level cave system with ancient burial material inside, then we are not looking at a loose devotional idea. We are looking at a preserved site memory. If the title of Jasher was repeatedly weakened, if counterfeit versions blurred the trail, if non-canonical status pushed the text to the margins, and if the chamber itself remained physically restricted for centuries, then the obscurity around this tradition is not surprising at all. It is exactly what you would expect. If independent witnesses across the 12th century, the 20th century, and modern reporting keep describing the same descent pattern, the same layered space, and the same hidden lower chambers, then the continuity is too strong to dismiss as coincidence. And if the burial line in Jasher sits calmly in the text, without trying to advertise itself, while later architecture, later rabbinic interpretation, and later underground access all converge around the same place, then the most reasonable conclusion is that this material is preserving documentation, not ornament. The limestone step is still there, still cold to the touch, still dropping below the chamber floor into the dark. The wall still narrows your shoulder when you turn. The air still tightens the deeper you go. And beneath the prayers, beneath the stone enclosure, beneath the centuries of restriction, the doubled chamber is still there, still holding what was put inside it, exactly the way the old record said it would.